Thank you. Hello, my name is Jason Montgomery. I am from Attacker Press, and I'd like to welcome you to our land sovereignty panel for the day. We're going to take a few minutes to get to know all of our panelists. They'll all have some time to talk, and then we're going to moderate a conversation where hopefully you will feel welcome to take part and ask questions. Introducing from the actually, you know what? Rather than me trying to rush through these bios, can we just all introduce ourselves? Starting with Rhonda.
Okay, Paganagetsi, Anupiachinaga Rhonda Anderson, Shabaktunga, co-founder and co-director of Okateo Cultural Center, and Western Massachusetts Commissioner on Indian Affairs. I live and steward on land that is on the Pecamagon River, or Green River today, in Coleraine, which was a traditional territory of Pocumtuck and Abenaki, and contemporary nations of Nipmuc, Mohegan, and Abenaki. Kuyana.
Antilia, do you want to see Alabama? Labrador, so I live in Northampton. I'm an artist, teacher, writer. Excited to be here.
Bukinapi Nistu Botanis, fully enrolled member of the Siksika Nation of Southern Alberta, Canada. Treaty number 7, which our traditional territory was separated by the U.S.-Canada boundary. The Blackfeet in Montana and the Siksika, Piikani, and the Blood in Canada. So I'm a resident of the so-called Pioneer Valley since 2005. I'm an artist, a visual artist. I currently have an exhibition on view at the Amy H. Carberry Gallery in Springfield. It's up until the 17th. Still a plug for that show. I'm a displaced, against my will, survivor of the 150-year residential school legacy in Canada. I'm a 60s scoop survivor. And again, I'm an immigrant, and I don't reside in my traditional territory. I'm a guest here on traditional Kumtuk, Nonotuck, Nipmuc territory. I've done some community work with Rhonda around land sovereignty issues here in the valley, in Berkshires, at Standing Rock in 2016. So we're both engaged in issues around land back and land sovereignty and revitalization of our culture, our languages, and our speaking out about our place in history and bringing those shared relationships forward.
Akwai Nathanael Rachel Beth Sayet, Nathanael Akitusut, Mohegan. Hello, my name is Rachel Beth Sayet. My Mohegan name is Akitusut, which means she who reads, and I'm from the Mohegan Nation, not the Mohican, but the Mohegan, in southeastern, what is known as Connecticut now. And I moved here for a position at the 5 colleges, so this isn't my traditional homelands either. I worked for my community for many years before this, and spent time on the burial committee and other traditional roles. My mother was the medicine woman up until a couple years ago in my tribe. My great aunt was Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was also a medicine woman. And so they passed down many teachings to me. Gladys and her brother Harold founded our tribe's museum, which is the oldest native-run museum in the country, founded in 1931. So I spent some of my youth working there, and then right before I moved out to this area, I currently live in South Hadley. I actually was working there as a curator and exhibit coordinator, and it's called the Tantaquidgeon Museum, and it's open throughout the year. You can find out the exact hours. It's a small museum, but it's all Mohegans and a lot of sacred objects and very important objects to the tribe that we passed down, some things that date back as far as Uncas's time, back in the 1600s. So I also do a lot of work with food sovereignty and did a lot of revitalization amongst my tribe while I was there with revitalizing traditional foods. So I'll be speaking to some of that
So I'd like to thank everyone for being here. My name is Jason Montgomery. I am from the Akumiye and Tonto people of Southern California, so I'm also a guest here. I feel a little bit strange, and I have been debating back and forth whether or not when we have a conversation about land sovereignty and we're sitting in essentially someone who colonized Holyoke, whether or not we should be issuing a land acknowledgement. And I've been going back and forth, but this is the traditional land of the Nipmuc, and Wampanoag people, and that should be acknowledged regardless of the other space that we're in. And I want to thank our panel for taking a moment to introduce themselves and introduce that to the crowd. I was hoping that everyone on stage could take a few minutes and kind of weigh in before we actually have more of a conversation. And Rhonda, if you'd like to start us off talking about the work that you've been doing over at Okateo and the larger work and how that kind of represents the larger work of returning land and providing land back to the Native people in which it was taken from.
Great, okay, thank you.
I'm
Thank you
also
very
going to
much.
use the mic. Sorry. Yeah, the important bit is that we all can hear each other.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jason, Attack Bear Press, Wistariahurst, and it's important also when we're talking about land acknowledgements, like you have homework to do. There are 5 bills in the State House right now that 6 tribes of Massachusetts support. So go to maindigenousagenda.org, learn how you can support, and really be active listeners today. Deep listening is how we are going to change things. So I guess I'll tell a story about how Okateo started. Gosh, it was 2017, early 2017. Anthony and I had just come back from Standing Rock, and my very close friend, Larry Spotted Crow Man, was speaking at UMass as a Nipmuc individual, people of the fresh water, and he was talking about what being a water protector means in his cultures. And so I went, I supported, I was super excited to go there, see other people from Standing Rock, and support my friend Larry coming out to Western Massachusetts. And I ended up being sandwiched between Carlos Iriona and Jennifer Johnson from Double Edge Theater. And Double Edge Theater is a really great immersive theater company out in Ashfield, Massachusetts. And every year in May, they do a town-wide spectacle, or they have a parade with different performances leading up to the lake in town. And they wanted to have an indigenous perspective. And so they went to the town historian in Ashfield, and the town historian said, there were never Native people here, and there are no Native people here now. So thankfully, Stacy Klein, the founder and artistic director of Double Edge, said no, and sent off Carlos and Jennifer to go find out more. And so being sandwiched between them, I ended up being this liaison of sorts, letting them know this is not true. There are indigenous communities, tribal communities that are state and federally recognized that are here. This was an active community area. And one of the things that Stacy really listened to was the amount of land dispossession. How come I'm not hearing this? Why is this invisibilized? And so she said, maybe I just got a facilities grant, and perhaps we can redo this barn and turn it into a library so people can learn more about Indigenous people. And I said, great idea, but let's do it one step better and make this in a cultural center so that Indigenous people can come out and you can create relationships with and have Indigenous people come back to the land in which they're from. Aha. So she listened. And that is ultimately the space that was created. Okateo Cultural Center was started essentially as a space with that idea born in 2017. a space that was safe for Native people to come and have ceremonies or workshops or just hang out, you know. We had our very first event in 2019, that opened up Okateo Cultural Center, and that was the solstice, December 21st, 2019, and you can guess what happened right after that, right? We ended up having to change everything we knew about what this center was. And during that process, Double Edge Theater became our fiscal sponsor. They created land back, land use, land stewardship, land tenure with Okateo Cultural Center. So that if you drive through the compound that is Double Edge Theater, you're going to see Okateo Cultural Center and Double Edge Theater on all the signs. That means we have access to that land for food, for ceremony, for medicine. It's one of its kind. We haven't seen anything like this yet. We actually have a book that was written in Decolonizing 101, I believe it's called. And we have a small chapter about this relationship. It's been a lot of deep listening. It's been a lot of learning, mistakes, backstepping, stepping forward. It's been challenging, but this has been something that is greatly needed. We need representation in Western Massachusetts. We need to have a center that is not institutional, so it's not out of the 5 colleges, it's not out of a reservation. This is a place that's welcoming to intertribal folks, but Nipmuc centered, because Nipmuc is the tribal nation that is still here, that never left. So I guess that's probably the story of how Okateo started. We've changed a little bit over the course, obviously, with the pandemic. We started to do, and the murder of Mr. Floyd also changed how we are perceived. Someone came during the 9 minutes of silence and said, "You've been lied to. This isn't Pecumtuck Nipmuc land, this is Scotticoke." And so we were like, whoa, okay, so you're using a white document deed to inform you of tribal nations without going to the tribal nations. So I had a living presence about that, and that started our Living Presence series, which you can see online. They've been archived, and we just finished our 9th one. But we have done a lot on educating the wider community on who Indigenous people are, what our salient topics are in our communities, how you can be a better ally. So that's part of our land back, land use, land stewardship, land tenure.
If you'd like to speak on the subject, and I'd just like to say, being out to Okateo was eye-opening for me in so many ways about what we actually can accomplish. And if you have an opportunity to go to Double Edge Theater and/or are invited to Okateo, I highly recommend it. I remember I walked in the first time and tobacco lined all the walls, and I was immediately met with 3 young Indigenous youth who were both working on the space and kind of just being in the space. And it was one of the first times since coming to New England that I actually felt more at home, and simply the idea of occupation and usage was so important, because you lose that idea when you enter into these colonial spaces. And it's so weird to be having this conversation in a colonial space, and I just want to recognize
Awkward.
It's awkward. And hearing your child talking and babbling, and my kid just called and I almost picked up the phone, feels more natural around how we actually communicate and how we actually take up space. And so I just wanted to recognize that like, you know, even this conversation we're having right now bears the weight of the colonial practices that we live under and occupy in any given space. So if I seem a little weird, it's because I'm not used to not answering my children when they reach out to me. So
I just wanted to say you hit on something that was very important about why Okateo also was started, is that I grew up in Plainfield, the little rural town next door. I went to elementary school in Ashfield. I was the only Indian kid. And I wondered why this was, and how come the native folks of this area didn't live here, weren't proud of this. This is basically very rural land. When you get back out on the land remembers who you are. And in that process, you remember who you are. And so I felt that it was very important to get Native folks back out, not from urban centers, but back out onto the land, so that the land can recognize them and they can recognize themselves. And that's been happening. And we've been really focusing on Indigenous youth in particular to come out. And it's been very successful so far. Thank you.
Yes. So being here in the South, in Western Massachusetts, I get the rivers and I get the mountains with the trees and I get the kayak, and so it fulfills me. And so I've gone to Okateo and participated, and I'm with Native people as much as I can. And so that's comforting to me. So I participate on Zoom. Luckily for the pandemic, I can take language classes on Zoom with other Labrador Inuit. And so I'm in my 3rd class now. And so, I don't know, Nunatsiavut government is celebrating its 18th year of founding, like being self-independent. I don't know. So I had all this history and all this research, and I forgot the paper, because that's smart. And so what I know is we work really hard, and so all of us work really hard in our own, but it's all to contribute to the Indigenous population, let the non-Indigenous understand we are still here, and so. That's why it's really important, and I'm really grateful to be asked to join. So, because of residential boarding schools like Anthony, like my mother was taken and she lost her language, lost me, and, lost her culture, and so now in her 70s, she's, becoming proud again to be part of the Every Child Matters movement that we just had in Truth and Reconciliation Day, September 30th. And so, she wears her orange shirt every day, and she's Inuk, and she lives in the Indigenous building in Toronto, and she goes to, drumming class, and so we all do our own little part to be here, because settlers, colonizers, governments want to silence the Indigenous voice, kill the man and save, I don't know,
Kill the Indian, save the man.
I get all twisted about it thank you, and I have all these degrees and I can give you a written report, and I'm a journalist, and so I stumble on my words because I'm telling the truth in a place that I've been told all my life, you're wrong, you don't know what you're doing, And so it gets emotional being up here, and I don't know, I'm proud to wear the True North sweatshirt. The man that made it, Richard Pummock, the company went under and because of the pandemic, and so this is our land. This is Inuit Nunavut, and so that makes sense somehow. Pass.
Well, and one of the things that I think you touch on so beautifully, though, is that we're here to talk about land sovereignty, but we're not necessarily here just to talk about land sovereignty, because the concept of land sovereignty, how do you separate that from the people who see the land as being related to you, literally, quite literally, and that idea of this separation between these two topics or various topics to me seems odd. And Anthony, you and I were just having a conversation conversation in the gallery room about, like, you know, how do you talk about land when, and people when the two things are so interrelated that when one changes, the other is drastically changed, and when one is shifted, the other drastically shifts. And so I ask you as an audience to understand that, like, this is not a singular topic. And if you came here today for a master's lecture in land sovereignty law, well, I'm sorry, that's not the conversation that we're going to have, because that's not the conversation as it exists for the living indigenous populations of Turtle Island. So.
Yeah, I mentioned before that I'm a survivor of what Pope Francis admitted on the flight back to Rome, the Vatican. On the flight, he was asked by a reporter what his thoughts were, whether he agreed with what happened in Canada's 150-year history in Canada constituted genocide, and his response was yes. He didn't go far enough in the demands from the survivors. He went to the Vatican, which prompted his visit to Canada. He visited communities coast to coast to coast, Pacific, Atlantic, the far north, and he didn't actually rescind the document of discovery. He repudiated it, which basically, there's an important distinction in words, and unfortunately, I'm almost all the way colonized. I'm a survivor because what happened to me personally, experiencing the dispossession and the loss of my culture, my language through the residential school system, and then later being taken as a young child into the foster care system until I walked away from it at age 18. What that means for me is turning around and looking at history and seeing that direct connection that was severed from the land, from the language, from our kinships, from our relationships to each other, and not just being in the human circle, but the circle with our relatives, the animals, the plants, the medicines, the language that we use to distinguish these theories that are on our own and live in our bones and are occupy our, at least my subconscious. I dream in colonized thought. I dream in English. I emote in English. I don't speak my language. It's in the bone, blood memory of the things that I practice in my art. I bring these histories forward, and I talk about that land dispossession and the importance of what it means today for Native communities. We talk beyond borders. I'm, like I mentioned before, I'm a guest here on a land that's borne the brunt of many more hundreds of years of colonization than my nation experienced in the far west. It was no less brutal. This was an ethnic cleansing. It was a genocide. Blackfoot is an ancient Algonquin stock, so we have ancient ties to this area. The Blackfoot went as far north as the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And so we have ancestral linguistic ties to this area. And so what that means is, for me, it's a process of rediscovery. It's a process of reclamation. And it's hard for me as a Blackfoot man to hide in colonial spaces because of my size, and I'm not from here, but I speak from a place that's common to a lot of indigenous communities, villages, reservations, that dispossession and that search for, and that taking up of space and asserting the truth. Because our language, our languages were living and alive between us. There was no need for us to shroud anything in double entendre or misinformation or misrepresentation, because we don't want to misrepresent our own hearts when we're speaking and the language becomes alive between us and becomes this living, shared thing. My heart sees yours. My intellect meets yours, and then we can go together. So being that my language was taken from me, being that I'm a survivor of a 150-year genocide, through the residential school system, through the scooping of our Indigenous children from their communities. We have survivors that have come back to us from places as far away as New Zealand and Scotland, and searching for home. And in my own search for home, I found it here on this territory. You know, I was dispossessed all my life. There was no one sat down and told me who I was, where I was from. And so what we see today, we're healing in real time. Indigenous communities often remind the colonial establishments that of those initial agreements, those initial relationships that founded both the USA and Canada. So the language is still existing in those original agreements of how to live peaceably, beneficially together. And land back, what that means essentially is a stewardship of the land back in Indigenous hands, for the benefit of everybody. Land back does not mean get on the boat and go back to where you came from, because the elders say that if it's going to get done from people from every corner of Mother Earth are here. So we have this huge opportunity in front of us to go together and create these examples, because that's how we learn the best, is by seeing and revisiting and revitalizing these ways of relating to each other in a good way. And that's what the young people are coming to say now. They're hitting the ground with this language that speaks about revitalization and going together in a future that works for all of us, based on the fundamentals that were practiced here for millennia. As an artist, it's very important to me to do what I say and heal through my work. And my work is very personal, and it talks about the experiences of my family and the very real realities that so many Indigenous people face. And it's very common in Indigenous communities for people to be multi-generational survivors of the boarding school era here in the United States. Madam Secretary Deb Haaland is currently visiting communities throughout the United States to gather testimony from survivors and families of that legacy. And so what we're countering now and what we're seeing now in Indigenous circles of activism and revitalization are even people who step forward now and say the residential school system is a hoax. They're denialists, much like the European Holocaust. So again, on many fronts, whatever Indigenous nation we come from and it claims us, are taking that space and speaking our truth and bringing those stories forward that were carried by the ancestors, so that what they went through, that it mattered, that because we claim this space now, because we bring this truth forward, that we're speaking our truth now. And it's not too late. Like we're all individually, wherever we're placed by Creator, are going to have our own answers, because it's up to all of us. It's not and that just looks for you to look inside your heart and see where you sit in relation to everything else. And the fact that you're gathered here in this space today says one thing above all, that you're making your truth plain, that you're seeking other answers, that you're looking to the past and those relationships that built what we see today. You know, you hear so many stories about how many treaties were broken just by the US government, but those treaties still stand in law because the indigenous people never broke those treaties. There were treaties of trade, of peace, of friendship, of mutual sharing, of benefit, having no place for words that meant other things. I was speaking with my partner the other day about, just learning about the history of this area that we occupy, and that at one time I could be, my scalp could command a bounty of $12,000 in Boston if I was caught within 5 miles of the Connecticut River. A woman would be half that. The Commonwealth issued 79 declarations and proclamations of bounty, and how this area has its own history of unhealed trauma. And part of my work in the community is to address that and to heal those layers through ceremony and through my art and through my activism and through my relationships with fellow Native people. We find each other. I mean, for very many years I was lonely here. And I looked around for representation. I didn't see myself reflected back, and that's been the case all my life. And the fact that I have family now means so much, because I shouldn't be here. I should be dead. My 2 brothers lost to the streets, to colonialism, as a direct result of that dispossession. And the fact that I'm here, I fled to save my life, and to find family in the valley and in this area is a great testament to community and how we find each other and how things can be healed. And with that, I'll pass the mic.
Tabutni, Anthony, and all of you. I was just thinking about, so I only moved here a couple of years ago. Again, I have a position that goes until the end of the semester. That's a long title at the 5 colleges. Native American and Indigenous Studies Community Development Fellow. Just getting it out. But I'm just thinking about the 3 of them just, really provided a warm welcome for me. So I appreciate that. Just, same kind of thing Anthony's talking about, finding the natives here. And I mean, I didn't grow up here, so I didn't experience that. I grew up actually right on my reservation in Uncasville, Connecticut, again, named after our leader, Uncas. And so it was a very different experience for me moving out to this area, even though it's only about an hour and 40 minutes from my homeland, just to not feel that presence of, a few tribal nations right here representing where I am. We have, Mohegan, Pequot reservations right there. We have also a few others. We have the Eastern Pequot, Mashantucket Pequot, Schaghticoke, and so we have a few pretty. We're not big like some of the tribes out west. We're a couple thousand people each, but we're right there. And I spent a lot of time, especially as an adult, working for my community with my elders. So I've only started kind of, feeling that distance lately of just, even though they're not so far, just not having them, for guidance as I did, all of the rest of my adult life. So trying to check in with them as I can, but luckily we have the Zoom and other things, but it's not exactly the same. So I appreciate that community here and, what Okiteo is bringing and all of these folks here. I wanted to mention especially Ella, because the first semester in this position at the 5 colleges, my whole first year was remote, and Ella was offering a writing class through the North American Indian Center of Boston. And so I was basically still living at my reservation with all these obligations I had, and kind of, I felt like I was I feel like I wanted to make a movie of it or something, right? It was like the Indian in this virtual space, like still living on the res, but in this colonial space. And so I took Ella's writing class, and it was just so helpful, so therapeutic for me. It was an Indigenous writing group, and able to get some of those things out in writing. And I am a writer. I'm working on a book on native foods in New England, but I'll keep you posted on that. And that's one of the topics that I work on. But I also teach and write about oral traditions. One of my most recent projects was I worked on a state park plaque actually in Connecticut, Sleepy Giant State Park, and the plaque just came out, and it actually has one of the newer plaques to come out with actual Indigenous history and Indigenous stories on the state park plaque. So I'm really proud of that. I haven't been back to see it out, but I've seen the plaque. I was busy out here when they had the opening a couple weeks ago, but it's a pretty cool thing to see. So it's actually a Quinnipiac site, again, one of the related tribes in Connecticut. There's not that many Quinnipiacs around, so I worked with some of the Quinnipiacs, but also some of the other local tribes and some other professors that were working on the plaque with the state park agencies. And so a lot of my work has been about, when we talk about stories and stories with the land, my whole master's thesis, which was now much more part of my spiritual practice than anything else, was about giants and little people. And we don't talk about some of these things in the summer, and there's protocols around different tribes of how we speak about these things. But the paper, which was a long process, excuse me, was about stories and sites, and specifically these stories about Mashep the Giant, which are stories that many of us in these New England tribes around here teach and tell to our youth, and also it's also, again, a spirit that we may pray to, depending on our beliefs. Some of us may be traditionalists, as we call it. Some of us may be Christians, Jews, Muslims, all over the map. And some people incorporate traditional beliefs with some of the other spiritual beliefs in different tribes throughout the country. So I call myself a traditionalist, but when I was writing the paper, I wasn't really as in touch, I think, with the spirits as I am now. It was a long process, starting at the Newberry Library in Chicago, then where I was a master's grad student at Harvard, and then I finally moved home and started leaving tobacco, and that's when the paper started to come together about this giant. And I started to go to Sweat Lodge. I started to do these things. I believe it was my first time going to Sweat Lodge, around 2011 or something like that. So for me, it kind of all came together through the spirituality, through the land too, being on the land, praying and things like that. And so sites like that Sleepy Giant State Park are related to those stories. The stories surrounding that park are about Mashep the Giant, who's kind of the mischievous, more friendly giant, but also about another spiritual figure who can be a giant, Hobomako, which is a little bit more of a darker figure. And so you can learn more about that either at the park, or I can talk to you more later and share some information. But again, these are the stories, we talk about Mashep being taller than the tallest trees, wading through the waters, his homeland being out in Aquina, Martha's Vineyard, picking up a whale, sharing it with his people. These are the stories, of this area of New England that not only myself, I teach about, but my great-great-aunt. She spent the majority of her life, Gladys Tanaquidgeon, working with other Native people throughout New England, and also learning from them, recording some of the same stories that I wound up recording and sharing. And she has a beautiful piece, which I actually just worked on an exhibit over at Amherst with Hyde Erdrich, who's an Anishinaabe poet. It's amazing poetry. And she was a curator of this exhibit that'll only be out until, I believe it's January 5th, and that's at the Mead. And so I actually did some recording of Gladys's writing, of what she was speaking about with the giants, and that was really, really meaningful to me. And so they have that as part of the exhibit. And then I think there will be a publication upcoming too with some of my writing as well. So stay tuned for that. But, excuse me. So just thinking about all of those things, sovereignty, I was thinking, should we provide a definition of different types of sovereignty? But that's something sometimes I will think about. When I was originally writing that project 10, 15 years ago, I was thinking about the different forms of sovereignty, how we have political sovereignty, we have federal recognition, which was created by the United States government for governments that predate the United States government, which are these native governments. And they get to tell us who is a sovereign nation in that capacity. But for us as Native peoples, we always had our own governments. We always were autonomous tribes. And so that doesn't really mean that much to us. It's more, we know that we're sovereign nations. And so there's been writers, who've talked about different forms. So one of them being cultural sovereignty. So I was just thinking about what Anthony was saying, just the day-to-day act of healing that goes on. At my reservation, for instance, we have a tribal craft room, we have drum classes, we have dance classes, and we have various activities going on, youth groups and all these things. Most of these things were not going on when I was a kid. Some of them were, but again, some benefits of the federal recognition process, but also just different times. There's more activity. A lot of youth are really stepping up to the plate. They're really excited to learn the drumming. They're excited to learn these things. And when you look at our elders' generations, there's all this trauma, some of which Anthony was mentioning. A lot of them weren't always proud, right? So they weren't as excited to represent the Native culture. And in a lot of cases, they weren't allowed to. For even my great aunt Gladys, she wasn't officially designated medicine woman until the 90s, and she was already at that point in her 90s. And it was because we had to hide a lot of those things for so long. And with the Indian Religious Freedom Act, not until the 1970s, things like that, where we were hiding. In my tribe, and I think this exhibit may be still up at our tribal museum, we had something called the Sewing Society, which was at our church. And so these Native women would kind of talk about some of these things like spirituality or tribal culture. We're talking about the early 1900s, in a time where they really weren't allowed to, but it was at a church at this sewing society. So it was kind of like, little underground meetings about these things. And so when I always think about how grateful I am, right, when I can go to a lodge or go to a ceremony or, learn these different things. Like I didn't grow up doing much dancing, just a little bit, but the opportunities that our youth have for that, right, to learn those different styles of dancing and all of those things. I'm actually, my son who's here making some noise, I was just talking to a local community member, Justin Beatty, who is going to try to work with him on some drumming. So very excited for that. So, all of those things, I look at it as, decolonization, healing, acts of sovereignty, right? They're all daily acts of sovereignty.
And I'd like to comment on something that I've heard kind of across the board, and that is that idea of indigenizing colonial spaces. I know for back home, we were also excited when the Viejas band started the language center at SDSU. It was like this exciting moment, yay, we have a language center. It's at a major university. They're going to teach language. They're going to teach history. And then I got a D. And that kind of weird place of, do you think I need the mic? Do I need the mic? Okay. So, that kind of weird space of both occupying both the colonial spaces and also trying to be indigenous in those colonial spaces, and even how that reflects back on the idea of who actually is sovereign in those spaces. Am I as an individual part of a sovereign nation, or am I under the weight of these colonial practices? I know that D followed my transcript as far as I've gone in any other institution. But I would just like to ask, like, how do you feel personally about the kind of current state of what we would call native sovereignty in the United States? All of us, I recognize that all of us are not from this territory, and all of us are not necessarily even from this specific territory, but I'd still just love to hear your opinion on it.
Koyana, that's a really good question. I just wanted to underscore a few things. I made notes. I'm a note taker. I'm sorry. I just wanted to underscore what Anthony said. Almost every Native person you meet is either a survivor of residential schools, a grandchild of a survivor, or a parent, or so you, my grandparents were both in residential schools. I'm a Nupiaq Athabaskan, by the way. I don't think I said that in English. That's from Alaska. And to Ella's point, Alaska was the first huge land-backed settlement within the United States government, and Nunavut is now the largest in the continent. So that's pretty important. And Hobomok also has roots here in the Connecticut River Valley. That's your homework. You need to figure out what Hobomok did here in the Connecticut River Valley. As far as sovereignty goes, I think it's very important. Because I'm from Alaska, we have given up our rights for sovereignty. So we don't have a judicial system. We don't have a lot of other systems that are in place in most tribal reservations. Although my dad was a part of the ANSCA, Alaska Native Land Claim Settlement Act, which passed in 1970. The tribes in Alaska are considered, well, I should say the villages, Native villages are considered tribes, even though there's probably about 6 or so tribal nations in Alaska. Each tribe has, each village has their own set of challenges or needs or expectations, even in some cases languages and cultures. So it's a little bit different setup than here in the United States here. So we don't have tribal sovereignty. We probably should, because that might help alleviate some of our murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is of the highest rates in the continent, happens to be in Alaska. And that would probably be greatly alleviated if we had our own form of judicial system, or if we had our own form of tribal cops, which we don't have. Although there is a great, huge leap in a loophole in judicial systems and trying those cases of non-Native people who are 90% of them are perpetrators. They're white men against Native women. Can't be tried in tribal court, so that's a big loophole. I'm digressing. I'm probably making this very confusing. But these are all very important topics that we need to talk about when we talk about sovereignty. So we did give up sovereignty as Alaska Native people, although I am enrolled in my native village of Akitusut. I'm also federally enrolled through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I'm also enrolled in 2 extractive corporations that oversee all the happenings on our land in Alaska, so Arctic Slope Regional Corporation and Akitusut Corporation. So it's a very different setup in Alaska than it is anywhere else. So I'll pass that along.
Yeah, and for those who are not aware, there's registration through the Department of Interior for Native Americans across the U.S. That does not necessarily mean tribal enrollment and vice versa. It is a complicated legal. I know, Rhonda, you definitely can speak to it a little bit more than I can. But I was hoping maybe you could define the land back settlement for that you mentioned.
oh gosh, I'd have to have my notes. But it was about $10 million and about 100 million acres of land that went back to indigenous peoples in Alaska, which was a sellout. And my cousin, Etuk Charles Edwardson, he died angry about this. Gosh, probably in 2015, I think he passed away. He was still pretty upset about this, and he was actually in the middle of writing a 700-page deposition as to why the melting Arctic was Inupiaq land since time immemorial, because that's going to be the next land grab, is the open Arctic waters for extractive industry. So I don't know.
That's great. I was hoping just for a little bit of definition, and that was wonderful.
Yeah, so that's I think the extractive industry became an issue in Alaska, especially when oil was struck. Who's profiting from that? Well, that was the United States government because they owned the mineral rights underneath the land. And so this was a long process beginning in the mid-60s, right through 1970 when it passed, when all of the rights below the land became under the 13 corporations that were founded that oversaw that extractive industry, be it mining, drilling, timber, what have you. So that's what it is in Alaska. I don't want to confuse things because that's so different here. It's not the same. And the work that I do as a commissioner, I'm really shocked at the lack of representation and voice of Indigenous peoples, particularly in Massachusetts. And so I really strive to make a difference, and we're hoping to hear from tribal nations on what a truth and healing, maybe not reconciliation, because what relationships are there to reconcile? A Truth and Healing Commission might achieve in Massachusetts. So I think that's, for me right now, that's where I'm really focusing on, is doing better for the tribal folks in Massachusetts.
Okay, so can you ask the question again? Because I had all these ideas, and so just to get me back on focus, please.
What is your personal opinion on individual Native sovereignty or on Native sovereignty in general in the United States? Both either as an individual, because I know that there are times when I have felt less than sovereign occupying certain spaces. Yeah.
Wow. So as an Inuk with Kakani and Tuni, it's a challenge in just being part of the community. So I don't know, like by being here and speaking and with a group, they're my friends, like it's claiming myself and my family and my traditions and my ancestors. And so that's better than it was 50 years ago, right? So it's all progress. What I'm saying is it's all progress, even though it's not what the next person is doing or not doing, like being judged. So it's interesting to have this question because I had all these ideas, and being an artist, I get all these ideas, and I can make this, and I can see the color, and so, yeah, maybe I need to like go back to school or learn, like, because it's not just one answer. Like there's all these different chairs, and I can tell you, all my family relatives that committed suicide or died from substances or something that could speak better than me, but they're not here because they lost to colonization. So I don't know. It's hard. It's important to do. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that our voices are all expressing the fact that one thing about Indigenous people, no matter where you go, we're incredible historians for the sake of having to survive. I myself, some of my work responds directly to some comments that I received over the years as an Indigenous person. And again, self-identifying, because in my experience, lived experience, it wasn't always to my benefit to self-identify, even though I'm visibly non-white. But the issue of sovereignty is not something that's dead and gone, that the people that committed these land thefts and land grabs and it's very contemporary. It's still within our lived experience. Responding as an artist to people who've said to me in the past, I'm sorry what we did to you people. Well, here in my work is actual visual evidence from the historical record of what was done. And I want people to be viscerally taken in by these images of, for example, priests standing over giving last rites to a 5-year-old child, Indigenous child, before he was buried in a mass grave, in a casket. These issues didn't happen, for example, within my nation. We were the first to launch a land claims against the Canadian government when it became legal for us to hire lawyers in 1960. That case was only settled in 2022, last year. And not only did the Canadian government lump 3 other outstanding land claims into the 1910 land theft for $1.3 billion, they said take it or leave it. And you put this amount of money in front of dirt poor, poverty-stricken people living 3 families to a shoddy, moldy house. What are you going to do? And that's not something that's in the distant past. It's 2022. I'm only here because the United States ratified the 1742 Jay Treaty, which was important because these colonial powers valued trade in the furs and passage through the rivers and passage through traditional territory. The US ratified that treaty that allowed British troops to go back to Dominion of Canada, but the tribes were affected by that colonial imposed border meant that Canada was never ratified that Jay Treaty, which means that a Blackfoot born in Browning, Montana, present day, can't have that same right to join our fellow Blackfoot from the Blackfoot Confederacy in Canada, because Canada doesn't want to increase its roles of Indigenous people. It's plain and simple. These things are not relics of the past. They still affect and influence in a very real day-to-day way the lives of Indigenous people. What they can say, what spaces they can speak out in, what spaces they can claim. Canada was in many ways far more detrimental to the lives of Indigenous peoples in its history than people are willing to recognize. The land base of the United States reservations is only the size of present-day Montana. Indigenous people in Canada hold 0.02% of the original land that they occupied. The rest, 80%, is Crown, held by the royal family in the UK. That's where that relationship stretches back to. So if we have an issue with land claims, we approach these colonial powers based out of British law, founded in these documents that are held by the royal family, these ties, direct ties to the Queen, i.e. Crown land in Canada. If we want land back, land that's leased for pennies on the dollars to extractive industries, lumber, mining, oil pipelines, if we assert ourselves and say, this is unceded territory, we were coerced into making agreements that we thought were beneficial to us all in sharing, not ceding, there was no space for us to, why, who? But we've only gotten the right, we've been, in 1978, we were allowed to practice our traditional ceremonies here in the US, gather traditional medicines at the appropriate time of year. It's like, and again, face and assert our birthrights. And in these, revisiting these treaties and revitalizing them, and because again, the language that exists in those original agreements can carry us forward in a very real way today. So again, to speak up as an Indigenous person in a colonized space is just opening our eyes as Indigenous people every day in a colonized environment where we seek recognition in these colonial spaces, not of our own making. And that's what, in learning about these early encounters here in the valley, you know, these Indigenous people had their own ways of dealing with internal issues. And to suddenly be dragged into a colonial court to answer for trespass. And so that's where all of these issues, these frictions, and those exist in so many modern Indigenous people, because we, like I say, there are 80,000 living survivors of the residential school system in Canada. Canada spent nearly $2 million in private investigation in 2015 to find 2,000 living survivors who worked in those residential schools, who were walking free and clear, living their best lives without any accounting for the very real crimes against children that they committed. You know, these conversations are very real, they're very hard, they're difficult, but they're not things of the past. And we as Indigenous people, when we sit in spaces and we share our truth, our testimony as survivors, as sort of making our way in colonial systems, it's, on one hand, it's healing, like I mentioned before, we're healing in real time when communities throughout Canada especially announce, you know, they held press conferences in order to cry out that their membership are, you know, experiencing mass suicides due to the economic poverty, all this dispossession. You know, when the very places that colonial governments created to take care of the Indian problem are experiencing problems, and then people look back at these communities and the non-native communities, especially in Canada, and say, you know, why are you holding out your hand for more welfare? Or you're just living off the system. Well, what is it now when we've only been given the space to address our concerns within the living memory, the last residential school in Canada closed in 1997, well within the lifetimes of most people living today. And so the evidence of the impact of those systems to destroy us is just playing out in Indigenous communities coast to coast to coast. And so there is a way forward to heal, and we're doing it, and the young people are doing it, and we're returning to the drum, and we're very naturally, you know, in some ways the future is strong, and in a lot of ways, you know, the Indigenous population here in the United States comparatively on a national level is like, what, self-identifying 6 million maybe? Just a shade under, over a overpopulation of 400 non-Indigenous, and less than 1.5 million in Canada, out of a population of 80 million. So you look at these numbers, but what's happening on the ground here, and this is very real evidence of that, that we're doing good things. Like there's a lot of dynamism happening in fashion, the arts, literature, theater, music, from these communities that come from such, horrific legacies, but it's a shared history. And I'm just grateful that people are here today to hear some of these hard truths and heal along with us. I love what Jason said about my work, and I'll end with this, is that his response to my work at 50 Year Gallery and at Attack Bear Press, which he is a co-founder of, he responded to my work in a very real way, which meant a lot to me, and I'll carry forever. And he said, "This feels like a purge." And I hadn't had the language for that, and he gave that to me as a gift. And so this is part of my healing. And thank you for listening, and I'll pass the mic.
Thank you. I think I answered a little bit of the question already, just the general, what is Native sovereignty? I'll talk a little bit more about, I guess, some different pieces of sovereignty, and we could go on, kind of what Anthony was saying, like just the daily acts. But yeah, so in terms of my own community, our reservation was disbanded in the 18th century, and we have kind of a different history in that we never really had much land in my lifetime, and for a long time. And it's like that again, many areas of New England, they all have different histories, but we were small to begin with because it's a small area. But my tribe specifically, we made some agreements with the colonists, and Uncas is our famous leader for that. And excuse me. So we sold off a lot of our land, and a lot of it also was taken from us in those early days. And we sided with colonists in some early wars, and those histories still affect us to this day. Just being kind of working with the colonists during the Pequot War, for instance, and Mohegans and Pequots. The short history of this is we used to be one tribe, and during early colonial times, we had two leaders emerge. One was Sassacus and one was Uncas. And the folks who wanted to fight back went with Sassacus. The folks who wanted to side with the colonists went with Uncas. So then you have the modern-day Mohegans and Pequots. Later on, there were other wars. The Pequots divided again. So our tribe, the Mohegan, we used to be one tribe with the Pequots. We both have a reservation, but again, when I say reservation, it's really not much land. Our current reservation is made up of our casino, our community center, and our burial ground, our sacred park, Fort Shantok, which was a fort of Uncas, and that's where the fort is. That's where our burial ground is, and most of these spaces we've had to purchase back, and these were we're talking about before the land back movements in the 90s when we purchased back. Also, the Masonic Temple in Norwich, Connecticut, we purchased that back for a large fee. That's where one of our, it's called our Royal Mohegan Burial Ground is. So many of our chiefs and leaders were buried there. And that had its own interesting history. My mother, in her role as medicine woman, she had a lot of dreams and visions and still does. And so originally we were going to turn it into a kind of a museum, but I think it was going to disturb the graves. So they wound up just turning it into a memorial. But you can it's kind of nice. You can see an aerial view of a wheel of the different moons of the year, and then some plaques to commemorate. So it's important that that's there. But just thinking about the land aspect, for me, it's always been a hard piece where, especially because I do food sovereignty work, I was revitalizing traditional foods amongst my community for many years. I was working in our tribal library, and it started off with just kind of researching some different indigenous foods. I had a mentor who's Abenaki, who passed away a couple years ago, Dale Carson. She was a cookbook writer, and amazing friend and mentor to me. And so she got me started on the topic. And then I recognized, okay, so all these other tribes are starting to really, plant these big gardens, and depending on the tribe, it's a small garden, a big farm, and bringing some of these traditional foods back, whether it was, out west, the different types of traditional cacti, or out here, we were looking at the different forms of corn, whether it was, the Narragansett white corn, which is the same as the Mohegan variety, the flint corn, or some of the different Abenaki varieties. I just grew Algonquian squash this year, which we just had for dinner last night. It was pretty delicious. There wasn't a ton of them that grew, but it's a hard seed to grow, and that's a 10,000-year-old seed, so it was kind of exciting, just thinking about that, right? Eating that squash and just thinking about what that seed has gone through to be here today, right? And so, when I was working for my community, that was kind of the roadblock I was encountering was, we have a modern day casino, we have all these things, but we really don't have a lot of land, and it just wasn't the time for people in leadership to really, buy back farmland or, things like that. It just wasn't really resonating. So we did create some different gardens, and they do have a nice Three Sisters garden with other crops planted at our tribal museum, and then we have a more educational garden at our community center, which is our community center and government building. So that they bring youth there, different programming activities for the tribal youth, and I was involved in some of those. So when I stepped away, some of these, to take this position, it was, an adjustment in many ways because these activities are still going on to some extent, but it was really my baby where I was trying to get all this stuff off the ground. So now I come out here and I'll speak to folks and learning about, different spaces here. Back at my community, again, we don't really have foraging spaces. It's limited, not only in southern New England, but just in general. Every tribe has different policies and different things that, they may have fishing rights, they may not have fishing rights, they may have fought for fishing rights, there's, excuse me, there's so many different stories all across the country of these battles and some of them successes, and, we're all still working on these things today. So when it comes to land sovereignty, food is directly related because we're trying to find, foraging spaces and, places where we can hunt. And again, as far as my community is concerned, we don't really have one designated in our tribe, but people have to kind of go elsewhere to do those things. And, it's so built up in southern New England. It's, you have to find your little spot, right? People have their berry spot or, their different little places, and it's not always shared with a lot of different people because they're so small. So, we try to be conscious of that. I know a lot of us, even on this panel, do some foraging and, just conscious of, my great aunt always said, never take the first or last of any plant. And that's just, a saying, but it really does ring true.
We are actually over time, and I do want to honor our panel's time. I know I said I would open up for questions. Would the panel be open for maybe one or two questions from the audience? Is anyone in the audience? Sorry, did anyone in the audience have a question? Oh, yeah, oh yeah, definitely.
Thank you, guys. So it's so layered for people like myself, right? I was born and raised Catholic, Christian, I'm white. I never went through hardship, and in order to be able to even begin to understand, it's so layered. You have to deconstruct even certain wording, like cultural appropriation or colonization, because of what we were taught, growing up in school or just from our parents. So as someone like me, what would you recommend being the first step to kind of breaking down that barrier? That what could we do to help?
Thank you for that really great question. It is really challenging. I do recommend go to Okateo Cultural Center website. We do have living presence on land back. And just watching some of the living presence, as I said, we have 9. That will help get you a little bit more familiar with some of the terminology. And the terminology, maybe even that we use today, could be uncomfortable. Sit with that uncomfortableness. Make that your strength, right? Because we all have to take responsibility, and we all have to acknowledge those challenging words and truths of colonization, right? And we have to understand that this is not a historical action, that these systems are in place today for a reason. And, it's not something that happened 200 years ago, but happened yesterday. It's happening today. And everyone in this room also suffers from the effects of colonization, but we all have a different memory of what colonization is. So we need to be sitting together and creating a common memory. And in places like this, that deep listening is really essential for creating a common memory of what colonization is. There's a lot of different ways, like Rachel was saying, land back, that strikes fear into some white people, right? It shouldn't strike fear. It can mean many different things. It can mean allowing access to land for food sovereignty purposes, for medicines, for food harvesting, for ceremonial purposes. It can mean land stewardship, land tenure, on how to get lands back to its natural state, or a state that continues to benefit from human interaction in meaningful ways. It can mean actually giving back land to Native people. But it is different in every situation. Not every tribe wants to have land back for different reasons. Maybe they don't have enough funding to pay for taxes, or maybe they don't have Department of Interior to put that land into a trust. There's lots of different things. Get to know your Indigenous community of where you are. Lift their voices and their needs and their concerns. That's probably like the biggest step, that deep listening and getting involved. Because we need to create unity. Right? In order to do any of this work, we all have to be unified together.
Nice. So coming here is a beginning. Asking questions is okay. I know I grew up in that violent home, and do it perfect or don't do it. And so it can get nerve-wracking and scary to ask questions and not know, but by asking questions, you're vulnerable and other people are, and it's working together like unity, right? And, it's November is Native American Heritage Month, and so there's gonna be a lot in social media, and, I know NEPM, Channel 2 has all these shows and movies, and knowing that we're not a trend, we're not like, we don't leave here and not be Indigenous when we leave, right? Like we're still Indigenous. And so it's, you wear this, and you talk like this, and it's different, and I like it, and I don't like it. Why do you do it? Like is the building, even though it seems really simple, it's complicated. So I know there's Indian Country Today, there's NAJA, Native American Journal Association, there's, North American Indian Center of Boston, NACOB, I work for them. So like all these places that you can find out.
That's a really good point. Look into Eastern Woodlands Rematriation Project. Look into Nipmuc Cultural Preservation, look into Okateo Cultural Center, look into these different organizations that are already doing this work on the ground. No Loose Braids is another one. These are all local, and support the Indigenous people that are already doing the work.
Yeah, that was so important. Rhonda mentioned earlier that Okateo is a great resource to politically put your voice and your vote behind the bills that are put forward in in Boston. One of them is around education and informing future generations, current generations, people that education, academic, to learn about the history of the land and the relationships that founded and continue to inform us today. And it's you're doing your own form of resistance against what the educational system in the United States wants you to learn about Indigenous people. The U.S. education system, just the public education system, and just in general, only teaches about Native Americans up to the 1800s, the end of the Indian Wars. After that, we don't really appear in, we don't really see, as coming from an Indigenous perspective, we don't see ourselves reflected back, in modern, and still in relationship to modern contemporary society, and that's hard. So that's a great question, and I'm always happy to answer, because I know that the education system, for the most part, until you reach post-secondary, university, college level, the education system generally fails you in terms of what you learn about Indigenous people, wherever territory you occupy. So that's, yeah, we're asking you to be allies in that learning and that sharing, and we're always looking. People go like, can I even go to a powwow? Of course, like, go eat the food, buy the jewelry, support local Native artists, buy a Native CD, we're your neighbors, we're part of your community, we're always extending a hand of relationship, because you're our relative, we're relatives, and that's, you'll always find warmth and hospitality and welcome and in Native communities when you approach with a good heart like you are today.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think they spoke to a lot of these different things. I guess I would add a couple things. Rhonda mentioned Eastern Woodlands Rematriation, which is a great group I'm part of, and some of the work that we do is revitalizing ceremony, but also, again, with the food and the seeds and things like that. So I always tell people when they ask about food sovereignty, how can they help? And I always say, grow out Indigenous seeds, heirloom seeds. We have for generations been kind of, because of the lack of land in many of our communities, having to rely on our neighbors, our allies, to help with that. My great aunt helped with saving Delaware Sasapsing blue corn seed, and she had passed it off, and Mohegans come from the Delaware, but she had passed it off to a seed saver and historian, William Weiss Weaver, who's based out of Philadelphia, and I got to meet him a few years ago. And, again, many Indigenous people had been passing those things on, and if we didn't have some of those allies back then to save the seeds, we wouldn't be able to, bring them back today. And I guess another thing I would just mention too, as well as supporting all of these organizations, is go to the local tribal museums, the Pequot Museum, the Tanaquidgeon Museum, the Wampanoag Trading Post, all of these different places, Quina Cultural Center out on the Vineyard. There's so many, and educate yourself by seeing some of those tribal museums, and then there's also the many, as Anthony touched on, the many great Indigenous writers that we have too, and Ella included over here. So and many of my family members are writers too. Again, the exhibit that's up at Amherst includes many Indigenous writers, so it's a way to kind of get a sense of some of them. But there are so many. There are just so many these days, and there always have been to some extent. But we don't always use. Writing isn't our traditional form necessarily, so the oral tradition and speaking, for me, that's my favorite, and I think for many of us it just comes naturally.
I'd just like to say I love that you keep bringing up what's happening at the Mead, because I think 4 of the people here are either in the publication or in the exhibit. So if you do have a chance to go up to the Mead Museum and check it out, I think there's food. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, so I think there's food. With that, I think we'll wrap the panel. I'd love to thank all of our panelists for coming and speaking today. And please give them a... And I would like to thank the Wistariahurst for hosting this, the second year of doing a Indigenous and Native Heritage Day in which they bring people together to talk about these issues, and they bring people together to shop, because there are vendors here. So please, thank you so much, and let's eat something.